The Americans have been pushing this and this is the Trump administration's. I think we've talked about this before. I think the Americans would like to, wrap this issue up as quickly as possible because again they have bigger issues to deal with in the Indo-Pacific. The rise of China is a fundamental systemic issue for them. The Chinese Navy has grown so fast over the last 10 to 15 years from a small minnow in reality that was basically a coastal defense force to a navy that now has some regional, if not global, power projection capabilities. And as that continues, the balance of power between the US Navy and the Chinese Navy is moving slowly in China's favor. So the Americans got a huge problem there. So they want to see this issue in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region put to bed as quickly as possible. However, Mr. Putin, I think, doesn't want this at all. He sees it in Russia's and his long-term objectives to continue to push for a maximal approach towards Ukraine. He thinks that he has the capacity, scale of Russia, the military-industrial modernization of Russia, and the amount of resources that they've been pouring into the effort to eventually overwhelm Ukraine. And I suppose simultaneously he's looking at the Europeans, at the Americans, at the potential for fissures between them, both within Europe and between America and the Europeans, including Britain. And he may still calculate or think that time is on his side, and therefore why give up now? Just keep pushing. So that's a serious problem, and I'm not entirely sure that we've come to terms with this, notwithstanding the support that we've been giving to Ukraine to date.
And in Europe, the EU is discussing an 18th round of sanctions against Russia, but the US's own package of sanctions appears to have been held up by the White House. Is there any sign that this outside pressure is having an impact on Russia's capability to continue with the war?
Well, I mean, a really interesting question, and on the one hand, it undoubtedly is having an impact, but at the same time, when a country mobilizes on the scale that Russia has done, and even that isn't towards a full war mobilization, you can still, get around some of these, get around the issue of sanctions, or at least you can mitigate against their effects. So we should expect the Russian war economy or the extent to which the Kremlin has turned Russia into a war economy, which isn't fully the case, but is getting closer to that. It's sort of 7 to 9, maybe 10% of GDP of Russia's GDP is now being invested into the military. Put this into context, in the Second World War, Britain was investing up to just over 50%, the Soviet Union over 50%, the Americans over 40%. This is a true war economy to fight a total war. Even the Ukrainians are not really there yet. The Russians certainly are not there yet. But nonetheless, there are more assets being poured into that, in Russia at least, also in order to prevent too much disruption to the Russian, the way of life. So I expect that sanctions will continue to have a bite, but they're not going to win the war. They're not going to bring Russia to its knees or to the table, at least in the short term. What we need to be focusing on here is more, well, how do we assist the Ukrainians with the military side of things so that they can both defend themselves against Russia's attacks, but also to begin to strike back at Russia and at range, to put Russian cities under target, to put Russian infrastructure under target as well.
There does seem to be some concern in the Kremlin, though, about the idea of a recession. At the end of last week, Putin said he wouldn't let recession happen and instructed his ministers not to let it happen as well. Surely, even the fact that the Kremlin is talking publicly about this idea of recession suggests they're worried about the state of the war economy.
Yes, I mean, of course. I mean, they have to be because they want to both simultaneously project an image of almost invincibility, that they can continue going using Russia's industrial and economic resources, which are significant, but by no means to the scale I think needed in order to secure their objectives in Ukraine, particularly as Western countries, as European countries, have provided Ukraine with support. I mean, I think, and we discussed this before, that that Putin calculated in 2021, late 2021, when the decision was probably taken that Russia would invade Ukraine, I mean, a full-scale invasion, that the Europeans and the Americans wouldn't do a great deal to support Ukraine in the same way that they hadn't really after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and stirring up troubles in the Donbass. But there's a massive miscalculation on Putin's part. Britain poured in resources, then the Americans, some of the European states too. So, I mean, I think the Russians have to project this image of invincibility, but at the same time, they of course have concerns. I mean, Western countries could really go for the jugular with Russia. They could actually cause more damage. They could cut Russia off even further, and so on and so forth. But they haven't been willing to do that yet to the extent that they perhaps could. But even then, if they did that, there would still need to be both that would hurt them as well as Russia, but it also isn't necessarily enough to win the war on Ukraine's side of things. I mean, it requires more military support for Ukraine ultimately to allow the Ukrainians to be at a very advantageous position in the future should negotiations ensue. Now, if the Russians just want to keep going and that there's the bandwidth within the Russian system, both the economy, the political system, and beyond the military, to just keep pushing, then this could be a very long, protracted conflict that could go on for some years. And then it becomes an issue of, well, who is going to give up first? Will it be the Europeans, particularly if they're left on their own by the Americans and Britain, or will it be the Russians? Will they eventually relent and say this is enough? We can't continue doing this. It's having a significant and damaging effect on our economic well-being, particularly the economic well-being of the Russian economic and political elite, and is there a drag effect, and is it worth it in the long term based on what they might be able to secure from the victory in Ukraine, whatever that might be, or whatever shape that might take, or from gaining access to Ukraine's substantial resources, both mineral wealth, whatever's left of the industrial facilities, and beyond.
And we talk about where there are these gaps in support for Ukraine. A lot of this, of course, has come out of the reduction in US interest and involvement in stopping Russia's invasion. What do you think Ukraine and Europe could do at the moment to bring Trump's attention back to Europe and back to the Russian invasion? And actually, do they really want to do that, considering his input on the conflict so far?
Yeah, I mean, this is again another really thorny issue. I mean, the way that the way that President Zelensky seems to, the Ukrainians have been, trying to manage the situation or shape it, shall we say, is to point to the fact constantly that Putin is insincere, that Trump tried to negotiate some kind of truce or peace agreement, but the Russians, the Kremlin, simply do not want to play ball. To the extent that then the Americans and Trump and the administration realize or understand fully that Putin has no intention of any kind of peace and wishes to continue with the war. And not only that, but also that kind of stands against Trump's persona and his ambitions to act as a peace broker in this conflict. I think that's what the Ukrainians have been trying to do. We've, I suppose, been trying to mirror or amplify that as well. But there is a possibility, I suppose, along the way that Trump will realize that he's been played by Putin and may then support the Ukrainians far more than in recent months, even the last year or so. However, the Americans still have a key interest, as I said earlier, in what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, and they've now become involved in the Middle East to a greater extent than they wanted to, I think, because the geopolitical reality has forced itself on them. They are a truly global power. And have global interests in all theatres and can't really disentangle themselves easily from any. So is it possible? I'm not sure. This is the issue that Europeans really need to get on top of, grapple with, and take the relevant precautions, which requires significant investment in defence, in the armaments capacity, so that they can start manufacturing the kinds of equipment that Ukraine requires, and really to take take the lead, even, let's say, and not expect the Americans to, bail out European security, bail the Europeans out again, bail Ukraine out. This is something that European countries, Germany, France, Britain, Poland, Italy, Spain, and others need to take greater responsibility for. Otherwise, this may not end well. And we should not forget that if Russia does prevail, we will be dealing with a far more dangerous Russia in the future than the one that we're currently confronting. The Kremlin will have calculated, if it prevails in some way in Ukraine, it will have potentially calculated accurately that eventually it would use its weight, would use its resourcefulness, its determination to get its way in Ukraine, to secure its strategic objectives, and that the Europeans, Britain, would eventually buckle, and we will then see a proliferation of, I think, these sort of sub-strategic or sub-threshold attacks all across Europe. And also we'll be dealing with a far more dangerous Russia, which will have a battle-hardened army, will have a significant defense build-up underway, and we'll have to deal with a situation that's far worse than the one we're currently facing.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for membership at the link below or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.